now let me introduce our speaker, Betsy Griffith. Betsy is a historian, author, and expert on women's history, politics, leadership, and education. Her biography of suffragist Elizabeth Cady Stanton, titled In Her Own Right, was named, quote, one of the best books of the century by the editors of the New York Times Book Review, and one of the 5 best books on women's history by the Wall Street Journal. That book inspired Ken Burns PBS documentary, Not for Ourselves Alone, in which Betsy appears. In addition to writing, she lectures and teaches courses about women's history for the Smithsonian Associates, at Politics and Prose, and for other organizations and events. Betsy graduated from Wellesley College as a classmate of Hillary Clinton's, went on to earn her doctorate from American University, and was a Kennedy Fellow at Harvard. She has marched for the Equal Rights Amendment and worked with the National Women's Political Caucus and the Women's Campaign Fund to recruit, train, and fund women candidates. From 1988 until 2010, Betsy was the headmistress of the Madeira School, the girls' boarding and day school in McLean, Virginia. The Washington Post acknowledged her success in that role with its Distinguished Educational Leadership Award in 2005. As a volunteer, Betsy has served on many boards, including WETA, the Wellesley College Alumni Association, the Kingsbury Center, etc. In 1989, her work on behalf of racial diversity and inclusion earned her the Junior League of Washington's highest award. She's also a member of the Society of American Historians. Betsy is marking the suffrage centennial herself by writing a new book about American women during the period from 1913 to 2017 between the 2 big women's marches in Washington. So we eagerly await its publication, Betsy. So with that, please join me in welcoming Betsy Griffith.
For those of you who are also members of the Mary Sheehan fan club, you will understand that we met at Politics and Prose, and why I call the men and women who take my classes there my classmates, because I learn so much from them. It's more like a seminar than a teacher-student relationship. I'm delighted to be here. I love historical societies. I've spent a lot of time in dusty attics and basements across upstate New York when I was researching the Stanton book. I appreciate people who respect history and preserve history and understand its value to our understanding everything else which is going on in the wider world. I do want to thank Fred and Beth, who are sort of my tech assistants here. So we'll hope the whole system works and that you can see what you need to see. Without historical societies like yours, without people who treasure history, people like me would be unemployed. I really worry about what's going to happen with today's records. Are people printing out their emails? Were they giving them to the Chevy Chase Historical Society? How will I be learning? How will my successors be learning about life today? I was delighted to learn that you're going to the National Portrait Gallery. I suggest that you take your reading glasses. It is an exhibit filled with small but significant items, and you will learn a lot. I certainly did. Prior to my coming today, Mary shared some of the materials that were in your archives particularly about Minnie Brooke, but also the man and women who were featured in your recent newsletter. I wanted to just draw some observations about them because you've already read about them. That's Minnie Brooke, the woman who really was a very active suffragist member of the National Women's Party. Interestingly, because she was a Democrat, and Alice Paul was sort of anti-Democrat most of her career, a woman who had no children, a college graduate. Gertrude Stevens, of the same era, born in the 1870s, a Mount Holyoke graduate, the mother of 6, a widow, very active on the Republican side, invited to run for office for delegate by the Maryland Republican Party, active in the League of Women Voters. Harriet Peters, born 1884, married, we don't know about children, but politically active her whole life, particularly for widow and mother's pensions. So she's really a social justice activist. and the work she was trying to accomplish to get widows and mothers' pensions in 1916 was not accomplished until Frances Perkins managed to pass the Social Security bill in 1937. And Clifford Howard, who is a representative male, because lots of men were clearly involved in the suffrage movement in one way or another. But relating to all four of them, these were white, middle class, married, some mothers, educated, which made them members of an elite in an era when not that many women had college educations. Politically engaged, which was less rare because from 1890 on, a lot of women were deeply engaged in their communities, Black women, Jewish women, women in all kinds of categories, working for their individual causes to improve their communities. And it was increasingly common. It's what we call the club women's movement. And in the 1890s, you have the DAR forms, the Colonial Dames, the National Council of Negro Women, the AAUW and the Women's Christian Temperance Union were already organized, the National Jewish Federation, the General Federation of Women's Clubs, because women had education and leisure because they were middle class and privileged, and they wanted to use their brains and their talents to contribute to their communities. And without them, we wouldn't have had most of the reforms of the first 50 years, first 70 years of the 20th century. And a challenge is who is going to be filling those volunteer roles when more and more people are in two-career households. So the title announced in the mailing to you, Votes for Women, How the Battle Was Waged and Won, pleased me because it's really important to object anytime anybody says women were given the vote in 1920. Nobody gave women the vote. It was a hard-fought fight. It truly was a campaign, whether you think of it as a political campaign. They clearly thought of it as a battle, as really a war. I've titled it, I use the title Long March to because, partly because of the 1913 March, but because they slogged through decade after decade and just kept going in this very long march. The critical period is from 1913, the first Women's March in Washington, to 1920 when the amendment passed, because for that brief period of time, women who didn't like each other, women who disagreed on a lot of topics, formed a very brief and shifting coalition. And as soon as suffrage passed, they fell into disarray and competition again. They were divided along lines of race, class, geography, and causes, not unlike we see today. The topic of suffrage raises a question that we might want to pursue in Q&A about the nature of power. Women got the vote. Only one woman ever cast a vote for suffrage. All the other votes were cast by men. So did women have political power? How did they use what power they had? And then how did they use the vote once they got it? Or did they? So let's begin at the end. It's August 26, 1920, and Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby is at home waiting a telephone call, which he gets at 3:45 in the morning from the Solicitor General, whom he has asked to stand by at Union Station, waiting for the train, which is bringing the ratification certificate sent by the governor of Tennessee. They were so worried about sabotage on the part of the opposition that someone might serve them with an injunction before it could be signed, that the Solicitor General rushed it to Bainbridge's home, and he signed it immediately at dawn in his pajamas, we suspect. But there are no photographs and no hoopla. He did it to get it done. He was right to worry about an injunction because when two Maryland women attempted to register in Baltimore in October of 1920, the local registrar said that they could not, and it resulted in a Supreme Court case settled in 1922, Lesser v. Garnett, and Catt was prepared more about that. Carrie Chapman Catt was prepared for such a possibility, and she had put Charles Evans Hughes, former Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, former Republican candidate for president, in 1922 Secretary of State, just to be prepared to defend the women in the case when it got to the Supreme Court. But all went well. The certificate was signed, and the New York Times reported that the Secretary of State had been particularly diplomatic because by signing it as he did, he avoided inviting either Carrie Chapman Catt, president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or Alice Paul, president of the National Women's Party, to appear together. They might not have appeared together because everybody in Washington knew that they couldn't stand each other and had not appeared in the same room since April 2nd, 1917, the day that Jeannette Rankin, the first woman in Congress, took her seat. They co-hosted a breakfast at the Shoreham Hotel. They sat on each side of Congresswoman Rankin. They escorted her in a flower-decorated car to the Capitol building, and they hated each other's guts and never spoke again. Nor did most of their friends for 4 or 5 decades. It was an intense rivalry. So Secretary Bainbridge, to whom I will introduce you, Secretary Bainbridge, that's the article in the Times which commends him for diplomatically avoiding having these women come together. So he signs the declaration, but Paul and Catt both really wanted a photo op. Paul arranged to have photographers. This is Jeannette Rankin. That's not that's not the flower-decked car. That's Jeannette Rankin. This is Alice Paul, and she is holding a larger version of the flag you see pointed on the mirror. There are 36 stars, 1 star for every state that ratified the amendment, and she staged this photo op. There were also moving picture cameras so it could be shown in the newsreels outside the headquarters of the National Women's Party, which at that time was located on Lafayette Square on the corner of Madison and Pennsylvania Avenue. So it's directly across. So what was Cameron House and at one point was the Cosmos Club, directly across from the White House, strategically placed. Mrs. Catt got herself invited to the White House for tea. There's lots of irony to this because the photograph that's taken is of her with Mrs. Wilson because the president was still an invalid following his stroke. The president had supported the suffrage amendment for maybe 18 months of his 8 years in office, but Mrs. Catt had wooed him assiduously with charm and tact, and he always appreciated that she didn't nag him, he would say. So she presented him with an album with a thank you note from every ratified state, buttering him up. But that was only the first step on her triumphal tour. That evening there was a huge speech at Constitution Hall, and then she took the train to Penn Station, where she was met by Governor Al Smith in New York. This is a bouquet of suffrage yellow and blue flowers. It was tied with a ribbon hand-painted by the Tiffany Company. She was driven in an open car to the Astor Hotel to give a speech about the success, and women clapped so hard that the seams of their gloves split. It was a very big deal. In her remarks, both in Washington the night before and at lunch in New York, she gave a summary that suffrage had taken 72 years, 56 state referendum, 480 state legislative campaigns, 277 state party conventions, and 19 congressional sessions. She concluded saying that hundreds of women gave the accumulated possibilities of an entire lifetime. Thousands gave years of their lives, hundreds of thousands gave constant interest and such aid as they could. It was a continuous, seemingly endless chain of activity. Young suffragists who helped forge the links of that chain were not born when it began. Old suffragists who forged the first links were dead when it ended. In 72 years, Catt was counting from 1848, the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, pulled together by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and 3 other Quaker women. Historians now have a much broader view of this, and rather than credit just Seneca Falls, they obviously can trace women's interest in women's rights into the abolition movement because it was white and freed black women working for abolition in the North, who were not very well treated by the most liberal men in America, abolitionists, who said to themselves, well, wait a minute, how is my situation different? Although clearly vastly different since they weren't enslaved and raped, but there are lots of parallels between women's rights and African American rights in this country. Always a connection, and really quite a tension might be a better description of that relationship. So it clearly took, but even, using 1848, that's still 72 years. That's a really long time. That is 3 generations of leaders. The first, this is Anthony and Stanton, and their colleague. Hold on, backing up, we'll talk about the colleague in a minute. So you had Stanton, Anthony, and Lucy Stone. Stanton saw Stone as her rival, so in her 6-volume history of women's suffrage, she doesn't mention Lucy Stone, or most African American leaders as well. The second generation would be Carrie Chapman Catt and Anna Howard Shaw. The third generation is Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. During this 72-year period with the 3 generations of leaders, you also had a whole series of strategies and a whole bunch of schisms because these women were constantly fighting among themselves. The first fight came in the period at the end of the Civil War over the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th frees the slaves, the 14th makes them citizens, and the 15th gives them voting rights. What the 14th Amendment did was for the first time in the Constitution, used the word male as an adjective for citizens, which offended lots of women who thought they were citizens. So even though they couldn't vote, they were paying taxes, they were functioning in a community, so it came as a surprise to them. So Stanton was mad about the 14th Amendment, and then she was furious that black men were getting the right to vote and not white or black women. Abolitionists had all been in favor of universal suffrage. They wanted everybody to get the vote after the war. There were maybe 9 members of the Senate, Republican members of the Senate, who would have voted for that. Nobody else in the House or the Senate would have ever voted for universal suffrage. It was not going to pass. But Stanton's language in asking or demanding the right for all women to vote and her antagonism about all men voting offended lots of people. She wrote, for example, think of Patrick and Sambo and Hans and Young Tung, who do not know the difference between a monarchy and a republic and have never read the Declaration of Independence or Webster's spelling books, making laws. Anthony was less restrained. She said she would cut off her left arm if black men got the right to vote. You can understand why this is controversial, even in an era in which many people would have held those views as well. So Stanton managed to offend lots of people, but the hardest break was with Frederick Douglass, who had been a friend and ally for many years. In 1848, Douglass had been editor of the North Star, clearly a name taken from abolition and the Underground Railroad, in Rochester, New York. He had purchased his own freedom. He, by this time, was living in Washington, had dined with Lincoln, was a very important, probably the most important African American in this era. And he called Stanton on her language and says that blacks are suffering so much. When your children are dragged from their homes and their heads are bashed out and you're being lynched, then maybe you will be sympathetic to black men getting the vote. And Stanton replies, those black men didn't get here all by themselves. They have mothers, they have wives, they have sisters. And Frederick Douglass says what most men said in the 19th century, their husbands and brothers will take care of them, ignoring the fact that there were women who did not have husbands and brothers. They eventually patched up their relationship. Took a long time. Stanton's behavior over the amendments creates a rift among the abolitionists, and they split. They would have split on that alone, but then they split over strategy. Not included in the 15th Amendment, clearly they needed their own amendment. They needed an amendment that would enfranchise women. You all know that to get a constitutional amendment, it's a 2-part process. You need 3/4 of the states, and you can start at the state level, or you need 2/3 of the House and Senate, and you can start at that level. So there's a state strategy and a federal strategy. Stanton chose the federal strategy. She founded the National Women's Suffrage Association. She based it in New York. She partnered with Anthony. She didn't allow any men to be members. She not only espoused suffrage, but every other radical cause related to women. Divorce reform, property rights, communal kitchens, which all seem really sensible today, but were outrageous then. Lucy Stone, who's based in Boston, organizes a co-ed group because she and her husband, Henry Blackwell, have this ideal feminist marriage, why she kept her name. It will allow men, and they will work state by state, and they will attempt to get suffrage in that way. They were encouraged because even before the 15th Amendment passed, the territory of Wyoming had granted women the right to vote, and not only the right to vote, but service on juries, to be justices of the peace, to run for city council. And this was an enormous branding and advertising campaign by the part of the territory, because you had to have 60,000 people to become a state, and they were hoping to attract enough women to get a big enough population to apply for statehood, which they did in 1892. And when they applied for statehood with women voting, the Congress said, no, write a new constitution. The southern states said that states did not have the right to decide whether women could vote or not. There will be irony to this as we move ahead, when the southern states will then say, of course, that states have the right to say that women cannot vote into the period that we'll be talking about. In working on their state-by-state campaigns, they took whatever suffrage they could get. You could get suffrage for school board, or you could get suffrage for tax bonds or the state legislature. Presidential suffrage was pretty rare. Some states only gave presidential suffrage. The few southern states that would eventually grant suffrage gave Democratic primary only suffrage, which counted pretty much for presidential suffrage. But by the 1890s, neither side was winning. Neither side, it was exhausting, it was expensive, they made very little progress. The Anthony Amendment, which is the wording of the suffrage amendment, was introduced in 1878 by Senator Aaron Sargent of California. It annoyed Stanton no end that it was named for Anthony, because Anthony wasn't even there in 1848. Even though she was her best friend, she was still annoyed. And they have several hearings. They never have a vote. Stanton appears at one of the hearings, and of the Judiciary Committee, the Senate Judiciary Committee, and she is standing at age 65, and these gentlemen in lounge chairs are smoking and spitting and reading the newspaper and opening the window and shutting the door and paring their nails, and she says it was all she could do not to throw the manuscript in their faces. So in 1890, they decide to combine, and the American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Suffrage Association becomes the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and they find positions for Anthony, Stone, Stanton. But frankly, they're so old they don't care. Anthony is still stirring the pot, but the rest of them, the older women, are really willing to hand it over. Anthony is in the middle. Stanton doesn't even come to these events. But in addition to combining their efforts, they haven't really changed strategies. The state-by-state strategy is pretty much the one that they are pursuing. But they have changed their rationale. The Stanton generation made the case that women deserve the vote on a pure equity argument. We're equal, we deserve it. Women should have the vote. By the 1890s, the second generation of women argue that we need the vote. It's an expediency argument. We need the vote because there's stuff to do. We have reforms to enact. We will secure progressive reforms. We'll end lynching. We'll enact prohibition. These women, club women, have begun to get busy figuring out how they can improve their communities, and they would clearly have more success if they had the vote. But, and every organization, I had mentioned the National Council of Negro Women, the General Federation, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, they all had a suffrage division, like you all have committees. They all had a suffrage committee. And so they wanted to be part of this bigger organization. But every time you allied with somebody, so NASA allies with the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which is good. You get lots more members, and you get the respectability of Protestant churches, Protestant prohibitionist churches, no Catholics. But you also then get the opposition of the brewers, the saloon keepers, the immigrant men, Catholics. Bunches of people don't like you so much as they used to like you because they think you're going to use the vote to take away their right to drink. And that happened so when clearly the South didn't want black women voting, manufacturers did not want the settlement social justice women who'd come out of the settlement house movement voting because they would reform manufacturing and put labor reforms in place, hours and wages and restrooms. So they definitely didn't want women messing with all of that. Jane Addams has this wonderful remark about it's the beginning of the justification of using motherhood as a metaphor for women in politics, that these good mothers are going to take care of the home, which is the entire community, and they're going to be good housekeepers and sweep out all that scandal and corruption. So this is from 1912, and this is really, I'm using it as an illustration to suggest where support came from. So women more easily won suffrage in the West, partly because the West was still, until the Frederick Turner thesis, 1893, that the frontier was closed. But on the frontier, women had a more egalitarian life than in other areas of the country that had become more settled. They were hugely valuable economic partners. Western economies would not have functioned without family farms, family businesses, men and women working closely together. So there was respect for them, and there was this marketing. They needed women, so they were going to offer women benefits to come populate their states. The South remains anti-suffrage. The two gray states are states that gave are considering, they haven't passed it yet in 1912, are considering primary suffrage, but the South only wants white women's suffrage. And the suffragists are willing to say, we'll only give you white women's suffrage. It won't matter if you enfranchise black women because there are enough white women to outvote them. And in the Midwest, they could say it doesn't matter if you're worried about immigrants voting, immigrant women voting, there are enough native-born women to outvote them. As the leadership got younger, it got more conservative. Stanton would have been aghast. But in the Midwest, as I made reference to immigrants, that's where you have the opposition from city bosses and brewers and the Catholic Church. And a lot of women did not think women needed the vote. Privileged women who felt protected no matter what the reality of the laws were. And there were lots of people who sincerely believed that women were unfit to be active in politics, that it was too dirty, that it was too complicated, and women should stick to their tidy domestic sphere. So here we have, this is the second generation who don't look too young for the younger generation. It's Anna Howard Shaw and Carrie Chapman Catt, and they are dressed, they're dressed for the parade, the 1913 parade. This generation, unlike Stanton and Anthony and Stone, were college educated. They were socially conservative. They were nativist, elitist, racist. As opposed to their same cohort, Jane Addams recruits, Florence Kelley, the women who were populating settlement houses, who were working in slums with immigrants, who were very liberal-minded. The third generation is going to be Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, who will surface in the new century, and these women not only went to college, but to graduate school. They were less likely to be married than this generation. Paul went to Haverford and University of Pennsylvania for her master's and PhD, and Burns went to Vassar and then studied in Europe. And the two of them met after they'd been arrested. They met in a London police station. Paul was enrolled at the University of Pennsylvania, went to London to do additional research for her thesis, got caught up in the Sylvia Pankhurst, the violent side of the British suffrage movement, not the more conservative side, or the less violent side, the law-abiding side, as opposed to the bomb thrower terrorist side. But Paul was on the more violent side, and she was jailed 7 times and force-fed 3 times. So when she returns to the United States in 1910, she has a prison record and precarious health. She's not the only expat to come home. Elizabeth Cady Stanton had 7 children, 2 daughters, and one of them had married a Brit and lived in England for 20 years and came back when her mother was dying and then joined the New York State suffrage movement. And it's Harriet Blatch who says that this women's movement is in a rut. It bores the adherents and it repels our opponents. Let's spark it up. And so she's the first person to have marches in New York City and in New York State. They walk from New York City to Albany. She's very big on outdoor activity. And in 1910, at the National American Women's Suffrage Association convention, the NASA convention, Paul is invited to speak about the Pankhurst activity in England, and Blatch is invited to speak about what it's like to speak on the streets, and she invites volunteers to come down and practice standing on a soapbox. And I sort of wonder if you remember, Minnie might have been among them, because we've read that she did a lot of public speaking on street corners. It is not easy to do that, especially in a much more male urban environment than that would have been in effect then. The British experience is is significant, especially for Paul, because she totally bought into a parliamentarian point of view. She believed that the party in power was responsible for the legislation that was passing. Despite the fact that suffrage had bipartisan support, she wanted to blame the Democrats, hold Wilson, who would be elected in 1912, responsible, that it was up to him to get suffrage passed. This was a foolish outcome. So in 1912, the stage is set. We have the aging star, Anna Howard Shaw, who's begun to forget her lines. We have her understudy, Carrie Chapman Catt, whose second husband has died and is temporarily in retirement. We have the reluctant leading man, Woodrow Wilson, who won actually a 4-way race, but I couldn't find a button for the socialist Eugene Debs. And he only won because of the split in the Republicans between Roosevelt and Taft. He won with the lowest popular vote until Clinton. And the ingenue, Alice Paul. So Shaw is 65, Catt is 53, the same age as Wilson, and Paul is 27 when she's pulling off this fabulous event. So she is nominated to take over the Congressional Committee in Washington. The Congressional Committee had been run by congressional wives. It had an annual budget of $10. It held tea parties, didn't do very much, and Paul's going, pick me, which makes the leadership of NASA nervous that she's so eager. So they tell her that she has to raise her own budget. She arrives in Washington on January 3rd, 1913, inauguration will be in early March. She raises almost $15,000. She gets permission from at least 8 different committees, the Senate Committee, the House Committee, the District of Columbia Committee, the Presidential Inauguration Committee, everybody except for the Chief of Police, the Superintendent of Police, Mr. Sylvester, did not want them to march on Pennsylvania Avenue. It was really thought of as holy ground. Women shouldn't be on it. And plus, it was lined by businesses and government offices and bars and bordellos, which is exactly the crowd that Alice wanted. She wanted a big, diverse crowd. And he kept saying, just walk down 16th Street from DuPont to the White House. Pretty street, just be safe. She says no. She finally strong arms the Washington Post and President Taft and gets permission to use. She's using the congressional wives as her allies. So she's named to the Congressional Committee. She raises the money. She pulls off this coup, and there is a fabulous parade. Now, this is what Becca's going to talk to you about. So I'm only giving you highlights of the parade. The parade was fabulous. I mean, it had bands, it had marshals, it had women on horseback, it had hired pretty girls for $2 a piece to march, so it would be very attractive. It was color-coded. Artists wore red, lawyers wore blue, academics wore their, college graduates and academics wore their gowns. You only wore suffrage white, which has really become the thing, as all the congresswomen attest at the State of the Union address, with your banner. If you did not belong in any other category, then you got stuck in the suffrage white. Not only was there a parade, but there was a pageant. On the south side of the Treasury building, they had built stands for 20,000 people. Mrs. Taft was there, Helen Keller was there, and they had a tableau vivant where these costumed women, this is liberty, but there was charity and hope and justice, and they came down and they froze because they thought the parade was coming. And so they froze, and then they literally froze because it was really quite brisk. So they went inside because the parade had been halted. The parade had started at Grant Statue and had halted by the time it got where the National Gallery is now, because all those people, all those men, mostly drunk because they were celebrating the inauguration, had swarmed into the street. A bunch of Boy Scouts and some boys, young men from the University of what was called the Agricultural College, is now the University of Maryland College Park, held hands and formed a wedge. So women who were in these brigades, 4 across, so many deep, had to go single file. It took them forever. By the time they got there, they were beaten up and dirty and furious, and immediately charged Sylvester with inappropriate behavior, and there were Senate hearings. He almost lost his job. They made him resign. This was a fraught event in organizing it. There were fights over the color-coding costumes. There were fights over money. There were fights over the order of, who. Kat was there in her plumes because she's leading the international brigade, who led which brigade, who got what honors. But the big fight was about race because Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells had asked, Mary Church Terrell had asked to represent the National Association of Colored Women, of which she was president since 1896. Mary Church Terrell had 2 white grandparents. Her father was the wealthiest black man in the South. She'd gone to Oberlin for an undergraduate and graduate degree. She'd studied in Europe. She spoke 5 languages. She was married to the first African-American judge appointed in the district by President McKinley, who was one of the first black Harvard graduates. She always wore pearls. She was something. And she's still picketing in 1952, and there's a sign at the corner of F and 7th Street downtown you should go see at Terrell Place. But so she represents, 60,000 black women who want to be represented, even if it's only 6 of them who march. And Alice, Quaker progressive, is thrown into a complete tizzy and starts pouting. If I wanted a black march, there'd be a black march. I don't want a black march. So she finally decides that they will march at the back, at the rear of the parade. She tries to say that to Ida Wells Barnett. Ida Wells Barnett has come to Washington as a member of the Illinois Suffrage Association, which she helped found. So Ida Wells Barnett, you should all know who she is. Fabulous book by Paula Giddings called Ida the Lion, because she had grown up in the South, daughter of slaves, moved to Memphis, became a school teacher, bought a newspaper, and started publishing the truth about lynchings, investigating why people were being lynched. Published a book in 1892, The Horror of Lynching. Her press got burned, her paper got burned, she moves to Chicago, marries, is always radical. She and Terrell were both among the founders of the NAACP. So she's part of the Illinois delegation, and Alice Stone Blackwell, the daughter of Henry and Lucy Stone, the eminent abolitionists and reformers, Alice Stone Blackwell waltzes into the Illinois delegation, says, no, Ida can't march. So Ida stomps out and stands on the sidewalk, and as soon as Illinois goes by, she goes into a rank next to her friends, just where she intended to be. Now, there were, we think, based on observations by W.B. Du Bois, who was editing the NAACP's Crisis magazine, we believe 42 blacks, not all women, marched in the rear. 32 of them were members of the newly formed Howard University sorority, the Delta Theta Sigmas, and their male chaperones. But everybody else merged in. Nobody knows where Mary Church Terrell marched, and it would have been a challenge because she was a very light-skinned woman. So finding her would have been hard. So despite the riot, despite the fights, it was a huge success. I mean, people just said, amazing! The tableaux vivants were gorgeous, and the women were wonderful, and they survived the riot, and they were brave despite being beaten up on. So it makes headlines everywhere, and it annoys the hell out of the NASA leadership. Because here this person that they hoped was only going to use $10 has pulled off this huge coup and said, now we're going for federal suffrage, and they didn't really want to go for federal suffrage yet. So there was the next split is a generational split between Kat and Paul. It's a strategic split because Paul's going to go for federal suffrage and Kat wants to stick with state by state. And Kat says that Paul's parliamentary attitude about blaming the Democrats is stupendously stupid. And she's right. In 1915, Kat becomes head of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. She imposes what's called the Winning Plan, which is a two-tiered effort. She will woo Wilson, and she'll defeat opponents, and she'll cast Paul into the darkness. So Paul then, over this time, has started the Congressional Union and then the National Women's Party, which is meant to be a third party in 1916, the Democrats, the Republicans, and the National Women's Party, so that will include women who can vote for president, which is 12 states in 1916. And by this time, Kat has an enormous amount of money, and Paul doesn't have very much. Throughout, as you read about Minnie in your newsletter, she's showing up at all these things. She's in the parade, and when the National Women's Party is founded in Chicago, she's in Chicago for its founding, and then she returns in November to campaign. So she's very engaged in Women's Party activity, which was considered quite, I'm sorry, I missed these, that's Terrell. I'm not sure you can see her pearls in that, and Ida B. Wells. All right, holding here for a sec. Wilson barely wins. He's running against Charles Evans Hughes, the Republican, and Hughes does not concede until Thanksgiving because it is so narrow. Wilson squeaks through because he has promised to keep America out of the war. Within 4 months, America is in the war. And he didn't really have much choice because in February, the Germans resumed U-boat sinking of neutral shipping in the Atlantic, and German Ambassador Zimmermann sends the telegram saying to Mexico, just seize Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. You can have it all back if you ally with us. So he got sort of shoved into asking for a war declaration on April 2nd, Jeanette Rankin's first day in the Congress. So there are 4 days of debate, and Rankin makes a name for herself for voting against American entry into war, along with 56 other men. But only Rankin gets beaten up in every editorial as cowardly and crying. She did not cry. But it will have impact on her when she runs she decides to run for Senate she's a Republican from Montana. She decides to run for Senate in 1918. She loses on account of that vote. She always has an active public career. She's elected again in 1940, and after Pearl Harbor, she is the only congressional vote against entry into the Second World War, so she doesn't win after that. And during Vietnam, she, in January 1968, Jeanette Rankin, at age 70-something, is leading anti-war brigades and is interviewed by a newspaper woman who says, if you had your life to lead over, I think she was expecting her to say, I wouldn't have voted that way, but she said, if you had your life to live over, what would you do differently? And Rankin says, I would have been nastier. So we have the original nasty woman. So the country is rushing into war in the winter and spring of 1917. And Carrie Chapman Catt has said to the president, NASA will support you, we'll put suffrage on the back burner. I really think you should make it a war measure, an emergency war measure, because other countries, other allies are beginning to give women the vote, and if we're fighting for democracy, you should give us the vote. But she doesn't say any of that publicly. She doesn't criticize Wilson. She's been really a member of the International Women's Peace Brigade, and she pulls back from her pacifism to support Wilson. Alice Paul, not so politic. So in January, Inez Milholland, you might know, on that, Inez Milholland is the one at the parade who looks like a medieval queen on the white horse with the cape and the crown and all of that. Inez Milholland has been campaigning against Wilson in California during the autumn of 1916, and she dies. In January 1917, they have this huge memorial for her. The National Women's Party has a huge memorial for her, and they come back to headquarters charged up by the emotion of grief and say, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Partly because Alice Paul was annoyed that she'd never found anything as good as the parade to keep the National Women's Party in the headlines, in the news, with her street theater strategy of getting the vote. And again, Harriet Stanton Blatch, who had organized parades in New York and was still very active, Blatch says, let's picket the White House. Let's show the president that we are ever present. We care about this a lot. So from and we'll only picket till the inauguration. We'll just show our face. So every day, except for Sundays, and then some Sundays because it's when working women could picket, 12 women showed up, 6 at each gate, with their banners and their heavy coats, and if it was cold, they stood on heated bricks and they shifted off, but they were there for 10 hours a day. The president, imagine this, walking out without much, really no Secret Service, tipped his hat, would say, "Would you like coffee?" They'd say, "No, thank you." So they're all sort of politely ignoring each other. And then on the day before the inauguration, Alice is not satisfied that they really were a tourist attraction. People came and said, "Hi, ladies." And she wasn't getting the reaction she expected. So on the day before the inauguration, when it is freezing cold and sleeting, 1,000 suffragists march continually around the White House. And Wilson orders the gates to be locked and that they are to accept no petitions. So this makes them really angry. They were really cold, and now they're really angry. That the author of the New Freedoms is not offering freedom to women. So they say, we're just going to picket some more. War is declared. The headlines are all about the war. Alice is annoyed. So the signage becomes more in your face about the president. And there is a whole question about, is it patriotic, is it appropriate, is it good citizenship to be picketing the White House and objecting to the president when the country is at war? But they ignore all of those concerns and proceed. They do occasionally carry an American flag, as well as their banners, to sort of say, this is patriotic for us to be doing this. The war is very important for women. The war, American participation in the war was really short, about 18 months. But women filled in for the men who were being drafted. They worked on farms and in factories. Some of them went abroad. It was the first time the Navy and the Marines accepted women, yeomanettes, to do all kinds of sort of scout work. But it was a big enterprise, and people recognized that women were doing war service. So it advantaged suffrage to have women doing this work. But while these good things are going on, Alice is still trying to grab the headlines with signage. There they are leading to go to the in front of the White House. "Mr. President, you say liberty is the fundamental demand, but you haven't given it to us." And then they get a little meaner. Imagine you're fighting Germany and your sign says Kaiser Wilson. Not a popular response. So by this time, June, July, August, the bystanders are no longer friendly. They're grabbing the signs, they're knocking the women down, they're creating a melee, and the women get arrested for obstructing traffic. Not the hooligans who are beating up on the women, but the women. And they get sent before Judge Alexander Maloney, who was a Chevy Chase resident and mentioned in your newsletter. And he is not amused at all by this behavior. So he fines the women different amounts of things. His first fine is, he doesn't, so by the time he arrests them, they have been picketing for 150 days. And Lucy Burns says, if this was illegal for 150 days, why did you wait till the 151st day to arrest us? Not amused. So he says it's a $25 fine or 3 days in jail, and they go to jail because they have enough volunteers to keep filling up the ranks, so they're going to fill up the jails. It's the same strategy that civil rights protesters would use in the South. So Maloney ups the punishments to $25 a day and 7 weeks in Occoquan. So first they're going to the DC jail, which wasn't pleasant, but Occoquan was actually in some ways more pleasant because it was a model penal farm for African Americans. And these white women did not want to hang out with black women in the jail. They insisted on having segregated sleeping quarters. And the disproportionate sentences made them mad, made Wilson look bad, and it doesn't get any better. It just escalates throughout until in October, Alice Paul finally joins the line. Knowing she'll be arrested, she's wearing a fur coat. She's had her 5 newspaper subscriptions changed to the DC jail, and she's arranged for her secretary to come once a week to take correspondence. She's reassured her mother that she'll be fine. Lucy Burns is in Occoquan, and no one is being treated well at all. It was November 14th, just last week, you might have heard on NPR, was the Night of Terror at Occoquan, where 30 women were held up on their jail bars by chains, and they were punched by guards, and they were horribly treated. And Dudley Malone Field, who had been a Wilson appointee, an attorney, he'd been in charge of customs, was having an illicit affair with Doris Stevens, a suffragist. And so he quit Wilson and became their lawyer and got rid of habeas corpus and got them out of jail and basically rescues the women. There are, Paul, by this time, because she's still trying to get headlines, has gone on hunger strike. She and other women are on hunger strike in the D.C. jail. The Occoquan women are transferred to the D.C. jail. The Suffragist magazine's cover has a picture of the jail that says, "Temporary headquarters of the National Women's Party." Eventually, the horror of the women's treatment has gotten enough publicity that it has garnered national sympathy and the sympathy of the chairs of the suffrage committees in the House and the Senate. And so Wilson is pressured, and the federal government, the district government, which came under the federal government at that time, is pressured to let them go. And Paul, who always had her press remark ready, sort of like the president going into the helicopter, whenever she was put in a paddy wagon, she had her remarks. She knew there would be lots of reporters there. So she said, "We're being put out of jail the same way we were put in by a whim of the president, who is not paying attention to people fighting in Europe for our freedom," and that includes women's right to vote. In total, 2,000 women picketed in different combinations. College girls, congressional wives. Mary Church Terrell came with her daughter. There were fewer African American and working women and married mothers picketing after they began being sent to jail for longer terms because they couldn't risk it. Of the 2,000, 218 from 26 states were arrested, 97 were jailed, 2 were force-fed, Paul and Rose Winslow, and they were all pardoned 3 months after they were let out in November 1917. But meanwhile, Paul's in jail, really ill, random headlines, but Kat is about to win suffrage in New York, the largest state, the largest number of electoral college votes, by a margin of 100,000. It's huge. They've been trying for 10 years to win in New York. And that really then turns the tide of the number of states who have suffrage. And when women have suffrage, some of those states were giving congressional suffrage. So you have men in the Congress who now have female voting constituents, which begins to change their mind. Plus you have all these women who have been splendid in doing their war work. After the New York referendum in November 1917, there were 20 states that had suffrage, and eventually there would be 27, and for a total of 339 electoral votes, which is more than you need to elect a president. So, in January 1918, just 2 months after the election of November that brought New York into the suffrage column, the House votes for the very first time since 1878, and it passes 274 to 136, which was exactly a 2/3 vote. It was the first victory ever for suffrage. It was huge. The women were cheering so much they got thrown out of the gallery, and so they sang hymns in the corridor. 4 men came from sick beds on stretchers, broken arms that hadn't been set. 1 man left his dying wife and returned for her funeral. There were no votes from the South, and there were no votes from Massachusetts, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, or Ohio, Republican states controlled by manufacturers. So Kat is thrilled. Her strategy has worked. She buys a new blue dress. She's ready to launch into the Senate campaign, and the Senate does nothing. In your news clippings that Mary sent me, Minnie is participating in sundry she's standing on street corners down at 12th and Pennsylvania because she wants the Senate to vote. They're arguing for the Senate to vote. The Senate doesn't want to vote. The Senate doesn't want to pass it. And they are saying, "Wilson, help us." And President Wilson actually types his own speech and goes to the Senate and walks in the door and says, "I want to speak. This is not really greeted. It was not really protocol." On October 1st, he speaks to the Senate. If we're asking women to sacrifice to the war, we can't give them just grief. As the result of their sacrifice, we must reward them. For their citizenship, we must give them the vote. President leaves, they vote, they've defeated. So it loses in the Senate only by 2 votes. but it loses, and they wouldn't have brought it up if they thought it was going to pass. They knew it was going to lose. 5 weeks later are the midterms of 1918. The Democrats lose both houses. Rankin loses her Senate race, and more states pass suffrage. So it's now, the ball is rolling. It's just pushing along. So as soon as the new Congress convenes, which is always in the spring, these things are so much later than they were now. The midterms are in November. They don't convene until March. They convene on May 20th, 1919, so 100 years ago this year. 100 years ago this year. The House voted 304 to 89 with a 42-vote margin, and the Senate on June 4th voted 66 to 30 with a 2-vote margin. Suffrage had passed. Suffrage had passed the Congress. They had managed to defeat a Mississippi senator's amendment that this would only apply to white women. They'd pulled it through. And Kat, that night, sends telegrams to all of her members all over the country and says, be ready to go, we're ratifying. And so the ratification needed 36 states out of the 48. They got 6 in the first week. By January 1920, they had 22. By June 1920, they had 35. And no prospect for number 36 because of the 11 states that remained. Southern states were absolutely not even going to bring it up. And Connecticut, Vermont, and Delaware, legislative action was blocked by Republicans who did not want it, which left Tennessee. Tennessee had voted presidential suffrage only in early 1919. And it was a sort of democratic state. 1920, so this is summer of 1920. It's a presidential year. Ohio Senator Harding and with his Vice President Coolidge of Vermont, Governor Coolidge of Vermont, is running against Governor Cox of Ohio with his running mate FDR. And both presidential campaigns do not want to be blamed for suffrage not passing, and they're a little anxious of what will happen if suffrage does pass. So they're trying to be very friendly toward women. Paul is ineffective at this point. She has no money, she has no members, she stays in Washington. She sends one representative to Nashville. And Kat, who'd kept members active in every state, packs a carpet bag, thinking she's staying a few days in Tennessee, stays for 5 weeks, and helps get suffrage passed. The headquarters is the Hermitage Hotel. Everybody is there, the pros and the cons. This is Jeanette Rankin, who's the only woman to vote, in the House vote, the first House vote. The 1918 House vote, she's still in the House because she was in until March, and then she loses her Senate race. And they gave her the flag that flew that day. This is suffrage as they're approaching the 19th Amendment. You see what's next? I'm going to actually leave that on. The next picture is women in Tennessee, the pros and the cons. So the pros were, if you were for suffrage, you wore a yellow rose for the suffrage colors. If you were anti-suffrage, you wore a red rose. There was this War of the Roses going on. It was a very dirty fight. The liquor lobby kept a hospitality suite open 24 hours a day, so there was an enormous amount of drinking. The people who were pro-suffrage were threatened with kidnapping and business boycotts and primary challenges. And as Kat would write, the night before the Senate voted, the entire legislature is in a state of advanced intoxication. But the Senate sobered up and passed, the state Senate sobered up and it passed suffrage 25 to 4. So they were now at 35 and a half votes. Kat, we now have 35 and a half states. We are up to our last half of a state. With all the political pressure, it ought to be easy. But opposition of every sort is here fighting with no scruple. The antis are appealing to negrophobia and every other caveman's prejudice. Think of the source of this. It is hot, muggy, nasty, and the last battle is desperate. Never in the history of politics has there been such a force for evil, such a nefarious lobby. In short, the times I've been in Nashville, I've been called more names, been more maligned, more lied about than in 30 years I've worked for suffrage. I was flooded with anonymous letters, vulgar, ignorant, insane. Even if we win, we who have been here will never remember it with anything but a shudder. Kat never entered the Capitol. She stayed in the Hermitage Hotel because she didn't want to have a national figure messing with this. She had Tennessee women lieutenants. She kept her window open so she could hear the shouting. So we're now in the state assembly. They went into it thinking that they had a margin, that they had plenty of votes to pass, because the speaker had promised them that he was in favor and he had 12 votes. So the first thing that happens is the speaker turns on them and takes his 12 votes, so then now they don't have enough votes. So the next anti-action is to move to table it. If it gets tabled, it'll never get on-tabled, and that will defeat the amendment. And from an unexpected quarter, a man named Banks Turner, who gets very little press, he was sort of a ne'er-do-well Democrat, and the governor had strong-armed him. And he votes against tabling, resulting in a tie. And those of you who know your parliamentary procedure, when there's a tie, the action goes immediately to the floor. So the tie vote on the motion to table brought it to the floor for a vote. But if it was a tie on the motion to table, what would happen in the floor vote? Would they lose? Because a tie vote would defeat it. And that's when Turner holds, and the seventh name in the alphabet is Harry Byrne. And Harry Byrne, who was wearing the red rose of the opposition, changes his vote and votes for suffrage. So Harry Byrne is 27 years old. He's the youngest member of the legislature. He's a Republican from East Tennessee. His mother had written him saying, please vote for ratification. And Harry said afterwards, after he got chased out of the chamber across the ledge into the attic, and eventually held a press conference, that young men should do what their mothers tell them to do. Harry Burns, one vote, enfranchised 27 million women. So we do need to be thankful for the men who supported suffrage. And their mothers. And their mothers. So the amendment reads, the same language as had been introduced in the 19th century, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged on account of sex. But that did not mean that all women were going to be able to vote. Native Americans were not allowed to vote until another act of Congress in 1924 that was organized by this woman, whom you will meet in a tiny daguerreotype at the National Portrait Gallery. Asian women under the Asian Exclusion Act of 1882 were not citizens, could not vote, and there weren't very many Asian women because one way to control Asian male populations was not to allow Asian women to migrate. The territories were not mentioned. In the United States or any state, they didn't talk about territories because in 1878, had we bought Alaska yet? We didn't have territories. We didn't have enough territories to worry about. So Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines had to pass their own suffrage amendments. By that time, I guess the Philippines had been freed again. And not only black women, but poor women were held down by the southern states' poll taxes, because poor people could barely afford the poll tax for a man, much less two people voting. And then by the literacy test, which was randomly applied to black people, and the grandparent clause, if your grandparent were a slave, you didn't get to vote. And states had the right to put any prescription they wanted to about who could vote as long as it was not sex. So they found plenty of other ways to get around it. And then the District of Columbia did not allow women to vote. In 1920, Edith Wilson sent an absentee ballot with her husband to New Jersey and voted. So did Paul. And Mary Church Terrell could not vote. Mary Church Terrell never voted because she was always a resident of the District of Columbia. And Mrs. Wilson, as a widow, and Paul, as a district resident, did not vote. Paul is the only one who could have voted because she lived beyond 1961 when the amendment changed district voting, that you could vote for president in the district. So Mrs. Wilson and Mary Church Terrell did not vote. Paul would have voted. In 1920, Carrie Chapman Catt turned the National American Women's Suffrage Association into the League of Women Voters, which may have been good or bad. It was a compromise between her and Jane Addams. Catt really wanted women to run for office and be very engaged, and Addams said, no, let's do community organizing, and they ended up doing sort of good voter education, which may have kept women from being active as soon as they might have been in terms of political engagement. Alice Paul goes to law school, gets 2 more degrees, crafts the Equal Rights Amendment, introduces it in Seneca Falls, 75th anniversary of 1848 and 1923, and practices exactly the same strategy, has Republicans introduce it, ignores the objections of the social justice feminists, the women who are worried about women in factories and protective labor legislation. And Minnie remains an active member of the National Women's Party until the 1930s. Women did not initially vote. Very few, we don't think very many women voted because the number of people voting did not increase. Nobody was counting, except for Illinois, nobody counted women's votes separately. When they began to do that, women counted numerically made a difference for the first time in 1964. The gender gap, the difference in how men and women vote for candidates, appears in 1980. In 80, 84, and 88, more women vote for Republicans for Democrats, and since 92, more women have voted for Democrats than Republicans. And voter suppression remains a huge issue. You will all remember that from 2016. So women fought really hard to get the right to vote, and everybody here needs to use it, and to make sure every other woman and citizen in our country has the right to use it, and that we are countering voter suppression. So thank you very much. I know that went a little bit longer than I think Mary expected, but I would be delighted to answer questions on any topic about women's history, but about suffrage specifically. Yes, please.
Yes, you had mentioned really a fascinating little tidbit there about how the southern states had opposed the states having the right to control eligibility for voting.
When the Western states came in, when you want to become a state, you submit your constitution to the Congress, and they vote on whether or not you get to be a state. And Southerners defeated Wyoming's first attempt to become a state because they had women's suffrage. It's also the reason that Utah gave up polygamy, because the Congress would not allow them to come in as a polygamous state in 1896. So sometimes it has good effect. But the Southerners' argument was, in the 1890s, that the state of Wyoming did not have the right to determine whether women voted. Then as soon as it becomes an issue, Southern states are arguing, Wilson argues, that he doesn't want to get involved in federal suffrage because it ought to be a state matter. Wilson evolves from being, it's only a state matter, to, so I'll be in favor of state, he favors women's suffrage in New Jersey in 1916. And then because of the war, mostly because of Catt, he gets pushed that maybe federal suffrage is okay. And he really challenges the Southerners, figures out, Catt does the vote counting, that figures out that they can get suffrage without the Southerners. She was brilliant politically. She was counting every vote. She had whipped the vote. She knew where they were going to get the votes. And it's narrow, but it passes. Yes, please.
The name of Susan B. Anthony is, in this day and age, associated with the Republican Party and the anti-abortion
It's
cause.
wrong.
Is there historical?
No, none at all. Okay, so, sorry, microphone, I apologize. The question was about the Susan B. Anthony Majority Fund for Pro-Life. I write letters, annoys me a lot. So, when Stanton and Anthony broke from Lucy Stone and they had the National and the American Women's Suffrage Association, each had a publication. The National's publication was called The Revolution, a newspaper that covered all of their radical topics, and the other one was called The Women's Journal, and it lasted into the 1930s. The Revolution only lasted 2 years because they had no advertising, and one of the reasons they had no advertising was because Anthony would not accept advertisements from quack medicine doctors called abortifacients, which is what women took to bring on a miscarriage. And she thought she was against abortifacients because she thought women were poisoning themselves. She favored birth control. There were methods then that they wrote about in the Revolution. She also supported defense funds for women who were the victims of rape and killed their babies, who were guilty of infanticide. So Anthony was not anti-abortion other than that she thought some methods poisoned women and were unsafe. It just annoys me so much that she has now been grabbed by the other side. Yes, please.
There's a big display at the Susan B. Anthony Birthplace Museum in Adams, Massachusetts, about something called restalism, which they interpret as being anti-abortion. So at that site, they say that Susan B. Anthony had 3 major movements that she participated in: abolition, suffrage, and anti-abortion.
I don't think that's true.
I don't think it's true either, but
I'm stunned. I don't think there's any Stanton biographer who would, any Anthony biographer who would support that.
I agree with you.
And I'm stunned that they would say that.
So am I.
Goodness. Well, thank you for that information. I will look into it some more. Yes, please. I'm coming to you. I'm sorry.
Can you repeat the question?
I should have repeated the question. Why don't you stand up and tell them?
It was actually not a question, it was just a comment about the, I can use the microphone. If you go to the Susan B. Anthony Birthplace Museum in Adams, Massachusetts, you will see a big display about something called restalism. I think it's a name for a doctor in France or something, Dr. Restal. I'm not even sure it's a real person, might have been made up. Anyway, it's about anti-abortion, and Susan B. Anthony, apparently in the revolution, as you just mentioned being against these abortifacient medicines. That was interpreted as her being anti-abortion, and the Susan B. Anthony Birthplace Museum in Adams, Massachusetts, as I just mentioned, has a big display about how Susan B. Anthony was anti-abortion, and they highlight that as one of her 3 big causes in life. Temperance would be maybe a 4th one: abolition, suffrage, and anti-abortion.
Temperance is right. Abortion is wrong.
And I actually heard a family, I was in there a couple of years ago, and there was a mother with 2 little kids, about a 7-year-old and about a 9-year-old kid, and the kids were like, oh, why am I here, you know? And the mother was saying, well, what have we learned about Susan B. Anthony today? What were her 3 big causes? And they couldn't have cared less. And she said abolition, temperance, suffrage, and abortion.
Thank you for sharing that. I need to do more research about that. There is no serious historian I know. The editors of the Stanton Anthony papers, the Anthony biographers, I know no professional serious historian who would say that, and it stuns me that I'm going to look more into it. Okay, here, and then I'm coming to the back. Yes, please.
Outside of Iron-Jawed Angels, do you know of any other movies that give a good fictionalized treatment of the U.S. women's suffrage movement?
It's a question about fictionalized treatment. The non-fictionalized treatment is the Ken Burns piece, Not for Ourselves Alone. I can't think of any at the moment. I know that Hillary Clinton is working with Steven Spielberg on a book about just the ratification a book that was published 2 years ago that's just the ratification campaign in Tennessee. So maybe it's coming out next year. I haven't heard anything more about it.
The schisms, it would seem like
Oh yes.
for all kinds of treatments.
Yes. It's clearly dramatic. Lots of colorful characters. Was there a question in the back? Yes, please.
Slightly off a slightly different topic. What do you think will happen with the ERA, particularly if it's passed in Virginia?
The Equal Rights Amendment was going to be my second book before I got the job at Madeira, so I am deeply versed in it, and of course paying attention to it again now with my second book. There will be nothing but lawsuits. Passage by Virginia will make very little difference. It will get us to the 38th state, but it does nothing about the 5 states. There will have to be a ruling about the 5 states who reversed their decision. There will have to be a decision about whether the 7-year deadline can be changed. Now, the 7-year deadline was changed in 1979 when it was voted to extend for 33 months to 1982. No state ratified the Equal Rights Amendment after Indiana in January of 1977. So it had gone a long time without being ratified, and there were rescissions and court fights during that period. When the ERA passed, the Senate and the House, it had bipartisan support. When the extension came before the Congress in 1978, it no longer had bipartisan support. Extension barely passed. It got out of the Judiciary Committee by a vote of 17-16. It got out of the Rules Committee on a tie. And the tie vote was very fortunate because the Rules Committee was going to require, because it related to an amendment, that the extension had to pass by a 2/3 vote in the House and Senate. And they didn't have 2/3 vote. They have no Republican sponsor if they were to start over again. There's one effort to start over again. The new ERA, has no Republican sponsor. There are too many legislatures controlled by Republicans. It will not pass. I also can make a case that it's being marketed wrong. The Equal Rights Amendment will not get you equal pay for equal work. And that there has been sufficient now Supreme Court precedent based on Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the 14th Amendment, which the Supreme Court had begun to use in the 80s, mostly on cases that Ruth Bader Ginsburg had brought as part of her women's law project at the ACLU. But the court has a better record than you would think, because so much attention is on abortion, but on employment and Social Security benefits and jury duty. I mean, there's been a lot of advance for women. When the ERA failed, you might remember the enabling was, so there's the ERA language is the first part of the 3 parts of the amendment that passed. The second part was the 7-year deadline. And the third part was that states would have 2 years before it went into effect, so they'd have 2 years to sort of catch up. Almost every state, whether it was for or against the Equal Rights Amendment, Virginia included, went through its state statutes and cleaned most of them up. Whereas before 1970, you could find any place, just outlandish laws about what women weren't allowed to do. You couldn't have a bicycle route in North Carolina. You couldn't own a bar unless your father owned the bar before you in Michigan. But all of those sort of minor things have all been wiped out. So there's a constitutional argument to have it, but we can live without it a little bit longer, because it would have much more power if it passed with great bipartisan support and contemporaneously. No one's passed the child labor law yet either, and it passed in 1924. It's still out there being circulated. It's 10 votes short. Are we going to say we're going to pass the child labor amendment now? And it got, frankly, included in the Fair Labor Standards Act. We don't need it. And so I'm saying it's not necessarily, it would be better, in my opinion, it would be better to start over again than to have a bunch of lawsuits. And this is not the time to start over, because we can't win yet.
Can I add one?
Yes.
My company actually proposed the bill that's in Congress to remove Congress's deadline on the ERA in 2011 in the House and 2012 before the last 2 states, which actually prompted the continuation of this campaign. So if Congress were to take its own action to remove their deadline, which requires all of us to get everybody that we know across this country to insist that their representatives and senators pass this bill, that would go a long way when it goes to the Supreme Court, for the Supreme Court to actually reverse political action by Congress on its own deadline would be tremendously difficult.
I'm just going to say here, to quote, to sort of channel Carrie Chapman Catt, that's not going to pass in the Congress. It's not going to pass in the House and the Senate. The Rules Committee won't schedule it. They'll impose the 2/3 vote. We don't have 2/3 of the House and the Senate. I don't think that's going to happen. A more important bill, in my judgment, is the one that the House passed at the end of last year, of course no Senate action, which reinterprets sex. Because the other whole problem with the Equal Rights Amendment, it too doesn't mention territories. It hasn't been rewritten since, it actually got a slight rewrite in 1940, but basically the same thing since 1923. So it doesn't count territories, and sex is the wrong word. It needs to be gender, or it's not going to cover everybody we need it to cover. And they're the bill is to change the interpretation of sex in the Title VII, sex in Title IX, to retroactively make those bills more inclusive. Not a prayer in hell. But those things would you've got a better chance of that happening than I think you do of them reversing themselves. But it's going to be fascinating. The congressional history people, the people who do all that research will dig into it. But the bottom line is we do not have the votes on any of those issues to pass. Please.
Can we do one more question?
There was one there.
Yeah.
I would like to thank you for an incredibly impressive overview and articulately presented to us on such an important issue and probably the most significant political battle in our country's history that lasted so long and has such an impact on all of us. You are writing a book now about women's...
Oh, the last century.
When is it expected to be finished?
I'm hoping Oxford is probably the publisher, and it will come out in 2021, and I hope you'll invite me back. It's bookended by the 2 marches, but it's really covering the whole century, 1920 to 2020. And it's fascinating because the first piece of action that women agreed on was the Shepherd Towner. It was a mother and child welfare act to provide home nurses and improve infant mortality in 1920. And it barely passes, and then when women don't vote in 1924 in large numbers, male members of Congress defund it. So it's wiped out. But think how we're still addressing issues of maternal and infant mortality and how to support families. So many of the issues, especially the racial divide issues and the class, I mean, if they were divided by class, race, and geography in 1920, now they're divided by class, race, geography, and abortion in 2020. Thank you very much. You've been terrific. Thank you. If I could, I want to give a quick shout out. It's been so nice to see in the audience Madeira women and Wellesley women and former tennis players and friends from far and near. It's very nice to see so many friendly faces in the audience. Thank you so much.
Bravo.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Betsy, so much.